Thank you all very much indeed for coming. My name's Hugh Montgomery. I'm Professor of Intensive Care Medicine at UCL, where I also chair the Lancet Countdown on Health and Climate Change. So I've been focusing for 26 years on the human impacts of climate change. And whilst we focused a great deal on the impacts of climate change coming through disease states, I no longer believe those to be the major threat to my survival and that of my 19-year-old son. They're going to come from the societal impacts, which will be economic and military. So to discuss those issues, I have with me two experts. To save time, I'll let them introduce themselves. So Richard, who are you and why do you know about this area?
So my name is Richard Nugee. I was a general in the army and I wrote the climate change and sustainability strategic approach for the Ministry of Defence. And the whole idea of that was to try and get the Ministry of Defence interested in climate change and to explain why and how defence and more widely security is a key part of understanding climate change. It's not something that most people talk about. It's not a thing that most people think comes at the top of the agenda. But I think our security, our national security to be able to run our businesses, our national security to be able to run the way of life that we have today, which is a choice that we have made, is at threat from climate change if we just allow it to run away.
Thank you very much, Richard. And Laurie, why are you an expert in this field?
So my name is Laurie Laybourne. I'm the director of something called the Strategic Climate Risk Initiative, and I'm an associate fellow at the think tank Chatham House. And my work focuses on what next with climate change as we go over 1.5 degrees and as societies get shocked into greater instability. Now, that doesn't mean we've lost. It means the strategic context for climate action is that much more challenging. So our work looks at how we might navigate that. And a key dimension is what Richard's talking about, which is that the world is becoming and will become more insecure. And we will have to handle that insecurity and remain focused on decarbonisation, even as our attention is drawn away into conflict, into other cascading problems.
So let's just pick up on that very quickly to make sure we're all on the same page, because I'm always alarmed when I wander around meetings like this and see net zero by insert a date in the future. Can we just summarise just how bad things are now that we're punching vertically through RCP 8.5? That's going to take us to 4.2 Celsius, probably past 3 within 7 years. What does that mean to Earth's weather systems, and why should we be scared in the immediate future?
One of the most concerning things coming out of the science is it looks like the very resiliency of the Earth system. Now, the planet is a bit like a human body. It has lots of different component systems that keep the overall balance. The climate system, water, the cycle of fertility and nitrogen. It looks like that system is losing resilience quicker than we thought it was. We're seeing that with the extraordinary temperatures in recent years. And a good way to think of this, or the threat in store, is that net zero, if we were to reach net zero as we hope to by the mid part of the century, the story we tell is that that will be sort of victory, we've done it. But reaching net zero will be the most dangerous point in human history. The danger will be at its maximum because the atmosphere is like a bucket. You fill it up to a certain level. At that point, we would have stopped filling it up. And at that point, the risk is at the maximum because we have disrupted the Earth system at the maximum amount. So that will mean that after we reach net zero, we will have to increasingly empty that bucket to reduce the overall risk facing the world.
Thank you. So we're talking, those of you that have read the papers in the last 4 months of, say, punching through RCP 8.5, that would have been, Paris would have been 2.4. That's going to take us to very big binary state changes in weather systems. And perhaps I should turn to you, Richard, on those. So if we're talking about these binary state changes, the sudden divagation of the northern jet stream, producing the ring of fire that we've seen before, the switching off or the rapid slowing down by at least 81% of the Atlantic meridional overturn circulation. These are ethereal concepts, but why do they matter to human society?
So I like to think of climate and security in 5 different sort of buckets, and which are our energy security, our water security, our food security, our personal security, which is health, and actually the ability to ensure things. My son's flat uniquely was flooded, and there were 15 flats, I think, flooded in his street. his insurance went up by 500%. And he almost couldn't afford it just because his flat had flooded. That's just an example of a personal security. And the fourth is border security. But I want to concentrate on agriculture and food security. Because what we're seeing is Europe has had the most fantastic agriculture for the last as long as we can remember. It's why Europe was inhabited. And that has come about because the Mediterranean has been a stabilizing influence on all our agriculture throughout Europe. And it's provided, if you like, an ability for agriculture to create seasons and all the rest of it, which has lasted for millennium. The Mediterranean is heating up at an astronomical rate, far faster than the rest of the oceans of the world. And so it's beginning to affect the ability of Europe to create its own food. Far more worrying is North Africa. We saw the Arab Spring. Part of that was rising bread prices. Part of that was because of rising temperatures, not uniquely, but it was part of it. And what we're beginning to see is therefore material effect on our ability to grow food, material effect on our ability to grow, for example, trees. I was talking to the head of the Forestry Commission just recently. The southeast of England, trees are dying because it is too hot and too dry. And so you're beginning to see effects. If you think about agriculture, if you think about how much we rely on our own food, about 40 to 50% of our own food that we actually make, and 40 to 50%, 50 to 60% from abroad, if it's affecting us in Europe, it's going to affect the rest of the world as well, and some places more. That becomes an issue if we have to pay 5 times more, 6 times more, 7 times more for our food. We want to avoid that if at all possible, because we've been there before in the 1970s, and nobody was going on expensive holidays in the 1970s because they were spending so much on food.
Okay, Laurie, let's come back to you on that as well, because you've been party to a number of reports, economic, strategic, military, and so forth, about how these risks are coupled. So we look, for instance, at the heat wave from 2 years ago, northern jet stream split, ring of fire around the world, food production declined by 20% in Italy, prices went up, billions lost from the global economies. But at the same time as there wasn't cold water to cool French and Chinese nuclear reactors, at the same time that the Rhine was running at 34 centimetres at Calbe, so you couldn't get barges through, with the Panama Canal affected. So one event isn't one event, is it?
Yeah, exactly. So we did a major report that we published in October last year called The Security Blind Spot, which looked at how people in national security, and I mean that in the broad sense, so-called human security, not just the defence angle on what we might be by security, the broad definition that Richard is giving us there. And we found a number of blind spots, one of which is the mental model in some people in the national security community is of the first order impacts. The things you see in the news, the storms and the heat waves, they are very serious and need more attention than they are getting. But it is the knock-on consequences like you're describing there. It is it's extreme weather, both in Britain and in the places that it gets its food from, then leading to ripple effects like high food prices, which then leads to inflation, which played a role in the cost of living crisis, which has been one of the singular social, political, economic facts of recent years. And we are in a situation where the risk assessments, which effectively act as our situational awareness in this storm, like a ship in a storm, it's the radar, those risk assessments do not include often these cascading risks, right? So what they are doing is thinking that what is in fact a storm that we're now in, a cyclone almost, is just a little bit of inclement weather. And examples of that include most pension funds thinking that in a 4-degree world, something that will be biophysically catastrophic will only reduce their pension allocation, their assets by about 1%. And we have a similar problem in the context of, say, national security, where the mental model of slightly worse weather that is, of course, very serious, getting worse over time, does not include this cascading risk. And we've seen that today when the UK Climate Change Committee released its progress report on adaptation. And it is horrendous to look in there and see for food security, in this grid they have, which has got red, amber, and green when it comes to planning and when it comes to actual action on adaptation. The planning for food security in the UK is red. It is insufficient. The plans are not good enough. But then the evaluation of the progress is grey, because there aren't even the metrics for us to understand how that threat to food security is happening. Many people in the private sector do have some of that, but we've yet to bundle that together to give us an overall picture of the threat to our food security. And that's particularly important, because this is not just something that we're having to act to definitively avoid, though this reinforces that. We need to reduce emissions to deal with these food security threats. We are going to experience them, and we will have to remain focused on decarbonisation while also handling those food security shocks.
So Richard, let's look at the political and societal impacts here, because you alluded to the 2010 Kazakh grain crop collapse with that intense heat wave, which is attributable to climate change. That put up wheat prices from $150 to $350 a tonne in 4 months. Speculation on rice prices increased their price 400%. Lots of places couldn't feed themselves. You got migration into towns, that triggered wars and so forth, and migration. So how do these impacts, let's say, on a food price, how do they destabilise nation states? How do they lead to migration? And what does that do to our border security?
So there's two aspects of that. For us as the UK, I always used to think we're a relatively wealthy nation. If food goes up a little bit, we could probably afford it by sacrificing something else, and people would want to sell us food. But 2 years ago, I don't know whether you remember, and it's a pathetically small example, but it is just an illustration. We couldn't buy tomatoes in our supermarkets. And I don't know whether you remember that. And I remember sort of thinking, well, that's a bit odd. Why can't we buy tomatoes? Very, very simple fact. Spain had had a terrible drought. They had a shortage of tomatoes. They chose to sell to their primary market, which was the EU. So they chose not to sell to us because they didn't have enough to satisfy all their customers. So there's a piece here about, as the world is more and more affected by climate change, and as the food stocks become more and more damaged by it, our ability to buy won't be just going on to a spot market, which is what happened with energy when Putin weaponized energy as he invaded Ukraine. It will be, people won't want to sell to us because they'll want to sell to their primary customers, or they'll want to sell to their local community. That's one side of it. But there's a second side of it which is much more worrying, which is that there will become parts of the world where you cannot grow food anymore. And if you can't grow food, you can't live there. It's relatively straightforward. And particularly in parts of sub-Saharan Africa, there are places where you can't live because you can't grow food, and there's not enough water, there's too much drought, and the food just isn't working. Now, if you add that, there's a UN statistic which says that as a result of war, as a result of conflict, 90% of people who flee the conflict stay in the local area and want to go home. And the reason for that is really straightforward. They want to go home. They were forced out through actions that actually somebody else took. It wasn't their choice. When you come to climate change, and there's no definition of climate change refugees, but when you come to climate change, what the statistics are showing is it's not 10% will go abroad to find a life which is worth living. It's closer to 20 to 25%. Why is that the case? That's because if you stay in the region, you're going to be just as affected by climate change as if you stayed in where you had just been forced out because you can't feed yourself. So you've got much larger amounts of displaced people going around the world, and some of them will want to come to Europe. There's no doubt about that, and you're seeing that in the Mediterranean. Yes, of course, you're seeing that across the Channel as well. Now, it would be wrong to say all of those are climate change refugees. Absolutely, that's not the case. But that proportion of those who cannot feed themselves because their country has ceased to be able to create food starts to increase the numbers who will be coming because of that. And that's something. It's not a political point about migration and about migrants. It is a point that actually we need to understand what the implications are of those who have no food, who have nowhere else to go. Where are they going to go? They might just be coming to us.
So the scale you alluded to there, so we know that within 20 years, 18% of the world's surface area currently occupied by humans will be uninhabitable because it will have static temperatures above those of the Sahara. So that's 3.2 billion people migrating within the next 20 years. You can add somewhere between a third and 2/3 of a billion more because of sea level rise. That's half the world's population on the move or dying. That sounds to me like a grave threat. It's why I put it at number one, beyond malaria or Zika or any other impacts of climate change. But Laurie, what's being done about that at the political level? You alluded to your report, which last year suggested that not enough was being done. This was a blind spot, as you said.
I mean, I think the seriousness of the situation, which we've sort of heard hammered home here, it points to obviously the need for greater investment in what we have traditionally in the climate world called adaptation. Things are going to have to become more resilient. I think the question is what are the political battles going to be over how we might conceive of that resiliency, right? And there is a version of that is highly ineffective and very concerning. It is a very zero-sum or negative-sum idea of resilience. It's one in which we spend more time protecting borders over other considerations of how we might stay collectively resilient. And in a world where old alliances are beginning to break down and countries are becoming more interested in their own internal interests than necessarily collective action and so on, it's a particularly concerning trajectory. The other one is one in which, as there is this, I think, knee-jerk reaction that we'll see towards adaptation, I mean, there has always needed to be more adaptation investment, we've got to lay down some certain standards, some certain principles. One has got to be that any effort at adaptation resilience has got to be what is described as transformational. It's got to get to the root of vulnerability in the first place. So the root of vulnerability both at home, so it is not a lack of a flood barrier that means a certain community is vulnerable to the social, the health, the economic impacts of flooding. It is something more fundamental, into inequality, into the lack of services in a certain place. And that cuts globally as well, particularly when it comes to the issue of migration and forced displacement. So we've got to make sure that move to resiliency is one that is transformational, it's getting at the root of where vulnerability comes from, but critically it has also got to be resiliency that enables decarbonisation at the same time. We have to move beyond the idea that sometimes exists that resiliency can crowd out or not be can be mutually exclusive to mitigation, to reducing carbon emissions. And a really good example of how all of these things layer on top of each other is a street in LA off the back of the recent fires. There's a picture of this, some of you may have seen it. The whole street was burned down, but there was one house that survived, and that house was built under passive house standards. There's high quality standards that meant that the house before the fire was contributing to decarbonisation. Its emissions were lower because it was using less energy, which means that the bills for the people that lived there might have been lower, and it was probably healthier in other ways for that household because it was warmer and, or in the case of LA, it regulated temperature better. When the fires came, the fact that passive houses, from my understanding, are better sealed because of the way that they operate the exchange of temperature. It meant that cinders didn't get in through the roof, so the house didn't burn down. It was the only house on the street that didn't burn down. So that was something that was both reducing emissions, getting the benefits of reduced emissions for health, for bills and energy security, and survived, and was better adapted. And we've got to apply the similar design principle, because in this nightmarish world where we have failed to be resilient to what's coming next, like a ship that's then stuck in a storm, that didn't manage to sail around, that's stuck in a storm, we could get distracted on the immediate lack of resiliency instead of simultaneously navigating on focusing on reducing emissions.
Laurie, can I pick up on that, if I may? We're in Innovation Zero, but actually the key, I think, we can present a really negative message, and a lot of what we've said has been very, very sort of, oh my God, what's happening? And people need to know that. But actually, we need also to work out, in the way that Laurie's talking about that house, how can we prepare ourselves? And innovation, all the innovation that's going into not just net zero, that's a small part. That's largely energy. It should be a smallish part of what we're doing, because whilst that is going to reduce the amount of carbon dioxide and equivalents going into the atmosphere, we need to prepare for a world which is a different world, a climate-changed world rather than a climate-changing world. And that requires innovation. How do you live in environments where food doesn't grow, for example? How do you grow different types of food in different places? How do you protect yourself against intense heat? How do you protect yourselves against a lot more rainfall coming down all at once? I was once quoted in a newspaper as saying I'm the general who is arguing for bigger gutters on our houses, and they made a great joke of the fact that that's what I was really concentrating on. But the point was we need to adapt our way of living in simple ways to be able to cope with the fact that things are happening to us whether we like it or not. So we've got to try and reduce the emissions. Absolutely, we ought to try and get to net zero. But we've also, that is not enough. We've got to innovate in every single way to try and make ourselves more resilient, both as living in our houses, as we work, as we go about our daily business, to try and make sure that we can cope with something that has already happened.
Well, I'm going to, in a moment, open the floor to questions, but let me put this to you, Richard. You've worked in policy at a very senior level. We are still increasing our emissions. They're not in any way slowing down. The last year saw the highest rate of rise in atmospheric CO2 concentrations we've ever seen, and that was higher than the year before, which also broke the record. We've punched through 1.5 degrees. We've quadrupled the Earth's rate of energy gain in only 4 years. No one is taking any notice of this at the policy level, it seems to me, because if they were, this wouldn't be happening. We have people in the audience who are trying to get the fixes in place quickly that might save my life, and I'm 63, and that of my 19-year-old son. Where are the barriers and how do we overcome them? Because we haven't got 20 years to persuade politicians, have we? How do we liberate this audience to save my life?
Well, that is a huge question, Hugh, because it's not as simple, there's one barrier. There's an element of we live in a social media world, and there are a large number of people who don't want to hear this message and therefore will say it's all rubbish or it's not true. And you've got America going, or at least the White House going down that route quite loudly quite a lot of the time. And that, for the average person on the street like me, would turn around and say, so which is right? Is the White House right, or is what our politicians saying right? You know, it adds doubt. And if it adds doubt, I have to say, if you look at this country, it is extraordinary. There's some 75% of this country believe climate change is a problem, and some 65% of this country believes that we should be doing something about it. So we're slightly different to the White House as a country, I'm delighted to say. But there's doubt in people's mind, and therefore they don't know what to do to help. That's the first sort of barrier is have we got a really clear idea? And scientists have not been able to provide a story which really makes sense to the average person. And I think that's a real problem, because scientists will talk about RCPs and things like that. I don't know what these RCPs mean. I've never really bothered to learn, because I know that if it gets hot, it's going to be more difficult. And I don't really care about RCPs. What I do care about is it's getting hotter and it's going to be more difficult. And therefore, we need really clear stories and narratives to get through to everybody, not just to the scientists, not just to the policymakers, about actually we've got a problem. Houston, we've got a problem. We need to do something about it. Now, one thing I would say is, and I'm no apologist for any government, but actually having a plan to decarbonise our grid is the right thing to do. Because energy is, 82% of emissions. If we can sort out the energy system of the world, then we're doing a hell of a lot of good.
So we need to join up. I think you've seen that. You've got doctors and security and military people on the stage. We've got technologists and business people in the audience. I think my first message personally would be that we need to gang up and get that message to politicians and the general public. I'm going to look around. There is a microphone here. So we've got 5 minutes to take questions, and you've got 2 world experts. So please feel free. Don't hold back. Good. We have a question here. Thank you. And we have one here next. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. So we've seen wars being fought over oil and gas for the last decades. Are we going to see a shift away from that and to critical minerals and materials, and arguably food more so, in the next coming years? And how do we ensure that that doesn't happen?
So how do we avoid the resource wars, Richard?
So, if you, I've just been to Egypt actually, and went. And one of the things I was doing was talking to a number of Egyptians about what they understand about the vulnerability of the Nile. Egypt, as I'm sure most people know, is sort of linear along the Nile, apart from the delta where it spreads out a bit, and the Nile is absolutely essential to them. And the Ethiopians have built a thing called the Great Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, which will provide brilliantly a third of their electricity through hydropower. Fantastic. But they've dammed the Nile in a way that will take, if the Ethiopians get their way, 2 to 3 years to fill the lake. If the Egyptians get their way, 10 to 15 years to fill the lake, because as they're filling the lake, the water going down the Nile will reduce, and as the water goes down, going down the Nile reduces, it will affect Egyptian agriculture, almost all of Egyptian agriculture. So there's an example of, this is at cabinet level and presidential level in Egypt, saying, what do we do about Ethiopia's dam? So there is an example where actually, and they have talked, because they were caught on camera talking about it rather foolishly, talked about, well, do we bomb the dam? So there may be those sorts of conflicts. The Congo produces 50% of the world's cobalt. There may be conflicts, if you like, over that. And it was interesting that I spoke to the student group of NATO, so young officers in NATO, was presented this problem, and they turned around and said, the Congo must become our best friend. Not go in with weapons, go in with friendship, so that we can have some influence over where their cobalt goes. So there are different things to conflict. You don't have to have conflict, but it's certainly a possibility over time.
Thank you. And we had a question, I think, on this side. Thank you.
Yeah, hi. Just to kind of play on what Hugh was saying about tomatoes, and Laurie, what you were saying about that LA house that was kind of purposely encapsulated. And also what I read in the news a few weeks ago about what Yuval Noah Harari said about Trump and his fortresses. Are we not at risk of seeing, oh, we don't have tomatoes, and oh, there's, if we set up our sort of self-sufficient systems, that the world is going to become more and more like their own individual fortresses? That we are going to not try to work together. We're going to go back on globalization, whether what Trump is doing is right or not, focusing mostly on tariffs. But could that be a good thing for climate change? Or is that a negative thing?
So fragmentation, good or bad?
So we call this derailment risk. The idea that as the worsening, the consequences of climate change get worse, they could distract us from dealing with the causes of climate change. Like how you could spend all your time mopping the floor and not fail to be able to reach over and turn off the tap if a sink is filling up. And we think this is a major risk. We're seeing them in other areas. And it means that we have to understand that climate risk is not just something that we can definitively avoid. That's clearly not the case. We are now in an era of duress. We are experiencing the things we hope to avoid. And by the way, they're coming harder and faster than we thought. So we're called upon to have to navigate through them, which means that we will need strategies that maintain collective action, that deal with the root causes of a breakdown of collective action, including massive power imbalances and so on, to then ensure that we do what we're always going to have to do this century, which is reduce emissions. You cannot adapt your way out of a collapse of the Atlantic overturning circulation. No one can do that. That's like an end condition. So collective action has got to be maintained even under the duress brought by the climate crisis. And that derailment risk, that we could be derailed off that path, is a strategic risk. Our strategies will be threatened by the worsening consequences of climate change. Doesn't mean they are doomed. It just means we need to make those strategies themselves more resilient to what's coming.
But I would come back with a more positive note, which is a couple of days ago, China turned around and said, actually, we can be the leaders of climate. If America's not going to be the leaders of climate change, we can be the leaders of climate change, and we can pull everybody together. Now, they have a huge influence on the whole of the adaptation and the mitigation world, but actually, they were offering to be leaders. Now, debate whether that's a good idea or not to sort of become in hoc to China from a security perspective, question mark, but they're offering that sort of alliance. So it isn't just that we will become more competitive, there is opportunity to turn around and say, in this environment, we actually need to come together.
Well, look, we're 7 seconds before the end, and being a military man, he'd like us to finish on time. So thank you all very much for being here. Thank you to both my very distinguished guests. Thank you for your erudite input. And thank you again all for coming. And please keep fighting the fight. As you heard, we can't stop.
Good.